Most people believe control is loud. They imagine domination as force, persuasion as intensity, freedom as rebellion. That belief is useful, just not to you. The systems that truly hold people don't rely on volume or violence. They rely on something quieter: internal compliance. The moment you begin defending the thing that limits you, the work is already done. Those who dismantle deep belief structures understand this, not because they are dramatic, but because they are patient. They don't attack conviction head-on. They disturb identity indirectly. They interrupt certainty without offering replacements. What happened here, whether you intended it or not, operates on that same psychological level. It doesn't persuade, it corrodes, it doesn't argue, it makes argument irrelevant. The damage isn't emotional, it's structural, something fundamental loosened. And once that happens, the mind no longer needs pressure. It begins to move on its own. Most people believe control is loud. They imagine domination as force, persuasion as intensity, freedom as rebellion. That belief is useful, just not to you. The systems that truly hold people don't rely on volume or violence. They rely on something quieter: internal compliance. The moment you begin defending the thing that limits you, the work is already done. Those who dismantle deep belief structures understand this, not because they are dramatic, but because they are patient. They don't attack conviction head-on. They disturb identity indirectly. They interrupt certainty without offering replacements. What happened here, whether you intended it or not, operates on that same psychological level. It doesn't persuade, it corrodes, it doesn't argue, it makes argument irrelevant. The damage isn't emotional, it's structural, something fundamental loosened. And once that happens, the mind no longer needs pressure. It begins to move on its own. Beliefs are easier to move than people like to admit. You change them quietly all the time. About success, about relationships, about what matters. Sometimes you don't even notice the shift. A belief can be swapped out, softened, reframed. Identity is different. Identity is weight. It's the internal answer to the question you rarely ask out loud: who am I in this? Once that answer hardens, behavior follows automatically. You don't need to be convinced anymore. You comply because not complying would fracture your sense of self. This is why systems that endure don't protect ideas. They protect identity. They encourage people to define themselves through belonging, through language, roles, moral positioning. Over time, the belief stops being something you hold. It becomes something that holds you. At that point, disagreement doesn't feel intellectual. It feels personal. An argument against the belief registers as an argument against your existence inside the group, and the nervous system reacts accordingly. When identity is fused with a system, logic becomes irrelevant. You can dismantle every argument and still change nothing. In fact, the harder you push, the stronger the resistance becomes, because pressure doesn't weaken identity, it reinforces it. Being attacked confirms the narrative that survival depends on defense. So the person doubles down, not because they're convinced, but because they're protecting themselves. This is the mistake most people make when they try to change minds. They aim at belief. They present facts, contradictions, alternatives. They don't realize they're stepping into a space where facts no longer operate. The response they receive, anger, mockery, moral outrage, isn't about truth. It's about threat. The system has already done its work by teaching the person that separation equals annihilation. What actually destabilizes identity isn't confrontation, it's ambiguity, a quiet separation between who you are and what you've been defending. Not stated outright, not forced, just implied. When someone begins to sense that their identity might exist independently of the structure they've been protecting, something subtle happens. The belief loses its anchor. It no longer feels like a survival mechanism. It starts to feel optional. This is why effective deprogramming rarely sounds aggressive. It sounds curious, observant, almost indifferent. There's no urgency to convert, no need to win. Instead of challenging belief, it gently questions identity boundaries. It introduces space. It allows the person to notice inconsistencies without pointing them out. And that space is dangerous, not because it's loud, but because it's quiet enough for reflection to slip in. Identity doesn't respond to force. It responds to uncertainty. When a person can no longer clearly locate themselves inside the structure they've been defending, the structure begins to wobble, not because it's disproven, but because it's no longer essential. And once something stops being essential, the mind treats it differently. Loyalty weakens, defensiveness fades. The belief starts adjusting itself, trying to find footing without the identity it once leaned on. This process feels unsettling because it doesn't arrive as a revelation. There's no dramatic collapse, just a growing sense that something once solid now feels unnecessary, that the energy required to maintain it no longer makes sense, and systems cannot survive when they become optional. They rely on identity fusion to persist. They dissolve quietly, often without anyone noticing exactly when the shift occurred. The most profound changes don't announce themselves. They happen beneath the surface, where identity loosens its grip and belief follows, not because it was defeated, but because it was no longer needed. Certainty does not empower people in the way it pretends to. It stabilizes them internally, yes, but that stability is deceptive. It is not the stability of strength or resilience. It is the stability of a locked position. Once certainty takes hold, the mind constructs a narrative that explains everything in advance. New information is filtered, not explored. Contradictions are dismissed, not examined. Complexity becomes irritation. The world is no longer something you engage with. It is something you confirm. This is why certainty feels so calming. It removes tension. Growth requires tension between what you think you know and what reality keeps showing you. Certainty dissolves that tension by declaring the question settled. Over time, this creates a psychological stillness that resembles confidence but functions more like numbness. You are not reacting because you are grounded. You are not reacting because nothing is getting through. This dynamic is not accidental. It is the foundation of every closed system of belief. Cult dynamics exploit it with precision, but the mechanism is not limited to cults. Any ideology, identity, or narrative that promises total certainty is offering sedation, not clarity. The more certain someone feels, the less they observe. Observation requires openness, and openness is uncomfortable. It allows for the possibility that you might be wrong, incomplete, or missing something essential. Certainty eliminates that discomfort by sealing the system. Once observation declines, guidance becomes easy. You don't need to force direction on someone who has stopped looking around. You only need to maintain the certainty they already depend on. This is why highly certain people often feel strong while becoming increasingly predictable. Their reactions are scripted. Their conclusions are preloaded. Their confidence is not a sign of independent thought. It is evidence that the internal narrative is doing all the work. What disrupts this state is rarely argument. Counter-arguments assume the person is still open to recalibration. Certainty closes that door. Facts bounce off. Logic is interpreted as attack. The system defends itself automatically. What actually weakens certainty is something far quieter. The reintroduction of doubt as a neutral experience. Not doubt as panic, not doubt as fear. Those only trigger stronger defenses. The destabilizing force is unresolved questioning that does not demand immediate resolution. A question that lingers without pressure. A contradiction that is noticed but not fought. A moment where the mind pauses and realizes it cannot instantly categorize what it's seeing. This is not dramatic. It is subtle. And that subtlety is precisely why it works. When certainty begins to fade, awareness returns, not all at once, but in fragments. You notice silence where answers used to be. You notice hesitation where confidence once filled the space immediately. This is uncomfortable, but it is also alive. Awareness is not soothing, it is sensitive. It registers nuance, ambiguity, and uncertainty. T forces you to stay present rather than retreat into pre-constructed explanations. This silence is where deprogramming actually happens, not through persuasion, not through confrontation, but through the slow realization that the confidence you relied on was not a reflection of reality. It was a shield against it. Certainty was protecting you from complexity, from ambiguity, from the effort of continuous perception. It kept the world simple by keeping you partially asleep. As awareness grows, something else becomes visible. How much energy certainty was consuming. Maintaining absolute internal consistency requires constant suppression. Doubts had to be ignored. Inconsistencies had to be reframed. Emotional reactions had to be justified after the fact. When certainty loosens, that effort relaxes. The mind becomes quieter, not louder, less defensive, more receptive. This is why true psychological strength often looks uncertain from the outside. It doesn't rush to conclusions. It doesn't harden into identity. It tolerates unanswered questions without collapsing. It stays awake in situations where certainty would offer easy relief. That wakefulness can feel like vulnerability, but it is closer to clarity than any rigid belief system ever is. By the time you notice this shift, there is no dramatic moment, no collapse, no sudden revelation, just a subtle understanding that certainty was never the same as truth. It was a pause button disguised as progress. And once that becomes clear, the mind does not rush to replace it. It stays still for a moment, observing, listening, letting reality speak again, without needing it to be simple. The mistake is assuming that people stay trapped because they don't see the bars. Most of the time, they see them clearly, they feel them daily, but those bars also serve as a framework, one that organizes chaos into something intelligible. The prison answers questions before they can form. Why am I here? Why do others have more? Why does this hurt? Within a controlled system, even suffering has an explanation, and an explained pain feels safer than an undefined one. Meaning stabilizes the nervous system. It reduces cognitive load. When the world is explained, the mind can rest. This is why people defend structures that restrict them, not because the structure is kind, but because it is familiar. It offers a narrative that says, "This is how things are." And once that sentence exists, the mind stops searching. Searching is exhausting. Searching implies responsibility. Searching implies that if the story changes, the self must change with it. Leaving such a system is not an act of rebellion. It is an act of existential exposure. Outside the prison, there is no prefabricated explanation waiting. You are confronted with ambiguity, with interpretation, with the unsettling realization that coherence is no longer given. You must generate it, and that demand is heavier than most people admit. This is why even after external pressure disappears, the structure remains intact internally. The authority figure may leave, the rule may dissolve, the environment may change, but the mind continues to enforce the same limits. It repeats the same assumptions. It anticipates the same consequences. The walls persist because they have been internalized as logic, not control. At that point, the prison is no longer something you are in. It is something you are using. The devastating part is not realizing you were constrained. It is realizing that you participated in maintaining it, not out of cowardice, but out of a need for narrative stability. The prison gave you an identity, a role, a place in a system that made sense of your efforts and failures. Removing that structure feels less like liberation and more like erasure. Who were you without the explanation that framed your existence? This is why abrupt deprogramming fails. When meaning is stripped away violently, the mind panics. It does not thank you for truth. It retreats into defense. It clings harder to the old story, not because the story is accurate, but because it is functional. You cannot remove a framework without offering the possibility of another. Otherwise, the mind experiences it as annihilation. True deprogramming is subtle. It happens when the old explanation begins to fail on its own, when lived experience no longer fits the narrative cleanly. Small inconsistencies accumulate. Outcomes don't align with promises. Effort no longer produces the expected result. The prison's logic starts leaking, not catastrophically, but persistently. And this is crucial. The mind does not leave because it wants freedom. It leaves because coherence breaks. At first, the response is repair. The mind tries to patch the story. It rationalizes. It blames anomalies. It adjusts expectations. But over time, the cost of maintaining the narrative exceeds the comfort it provides. The explanation stops working, not intellectually, but emotionally. It no longer organizes experience. It no longer predicts reality. And when meaning fails, the mind is forced to search again. This search is not dramatic. There is no internal revolution, no triumphant declaration. It is quiet, almost disappointing. The old system is not rejected. It is outgrown. It becomes insufficient, like a language that can no longer describe what you are experiencing. And once a more accurate coherence becomes imaginable outside the prison, escape does not require force. The door opens because it was never locked in the way you thought. It closes gently behind you, not as an act of defiance, but as a consequence of relevance. The prison loses its power the moment it stops explaining your life. And this is the part few talk about. Freedom is not defined by absence of structure. It is defined by alignment between reality and interpretation. When your internal narrative matches your lived experience, control dissolves naturally. You do not feel liberated. You feel oriented, calm, precise, less dramatic than expected. In the end, the mind does not want freedom. It wants a story that works. When the old story collapses under its own weight, something quieter replaces it. Not certainty, but clarity. Not rebellion, but understanding. And once that settles in, there is no urge to go back. Not because the prison was evil, but because it is no longer necessary. The most profound shifts are not marked by noise or declaration. They are marked by stillness, by the moment you realize the explanation you were living inside no longer explains you. And without effort, without struggle, you step beyond it, almost without noticing. Control rarely survives on ideology alone. Ideas fade, arguments weaken. What endures is repetition, emotional repetition. Systems of influence, whether social, cultural, institutional, or interpersonal, do not need you to agree with them. They only need you to feel on time. Guilt appears, then relief. Fear, then reassurance. Belonging, then threat of exclusion. Over and over, the same emotional sequence plays. Eventually, you don't respond to the message. You respond to the timing. Your body anticipates the next emotional cue before your mind finishes interpreting the situation. This is not manipulation in a dramatic sense. It's conditioning through predictability. You begin to recognize when you are safe by how it feels, not by what is true. You learn when to feel valued, not because value was earned, but because the cycle reached its reward phase. And you learn when to feel wrong, not because you crossed a real boundary, but because the system requires tension before release. Over time, this creates emotional dependency, not on a person or an institution directly, but on the rhythm itself. What makes these loops powerful is that they don't feel imposed, they feel familiar. The emotional response arrives exactly when expected, so it registers as natural, even necessary. The individual starts organizing their internal life around external scheduling. When approval comes late, anxiety grows. When judgment doesn't arrive, confusion sets in. Silence becomes louder than criticism ever was. Breaking this structure does not require confrontation. Confrontation still feeds the rhythm. It provides the expected emotional spike. Anger, defense, justification, these are all predictable responses. They keep the loop intact. The system knows how to metabolize resistance. What it does not tolerate well is interruption. Interruption happens when the expected emotion fails to arrive. Silence where reassurance should be. Neutrality where judgment was anticipated. Calm where guilt was supposed to activate. In these moments, the system loses timing. It cannot move to the next phase because the cue didn't land. This creates disorientation, not for the system alone, but for the individual inside it. That disorientation is often misinterpreted as weakness. In reality, it is the first sign of autonomy re-emerging. When the emotional loop breaks, even briefly, you feel unsettled because your internal clock no longer matches the external schedule. You don't know what you're supposed to feel next, and for the first time, that question becomes visible. This is not rebellion. Rebellion still reacts. This is recalibration. In the gap created by interruption, something subtle happens. You begin to notice how much of your emotional life was preloaded, how often your reactions were not chosen, but triggered on cue. The realization is not dramatic. It's quiet, almost disappointing. You expected something more oppressive. Instead, you find habit, timing, familiar discomfort. Power depends on your participation in the loop, not your belief in it. When you stop delivering the expected emotional response, the structure weakens, not because it's challenged, but because it's mistimed. Systems built on rhythm cannot adapt quickly to unpredictability. They require emotional synchronization to function. Neutrality becomes destabilizing. not because it is aggressive, but because it removes the signal. The system waits for tension that doesn't arrive. It prepares for release that never comes. And in that delay, control loses coherence. For the individual, this feels like standing in an empty room after the music stops. There is no instruction, no emotional prompt, just awareness. At first, the impulse is to recreate the rhythm, to feel something, anything familiar. But if that impulse is not acted on, something else emerges, a quieter signal, one that is not scheduled. This is where autonomy begins, not as a declaration, but as a recalibration of timing. You stop living one emotional step behind an external cue. You begin to experience your internal state without immediately translating it into compliance or resistance. The loop dissolves not because it was defeated, but because it was no longer fed. Power maintained through emotional predictability collapses when predictability ends. Not with noise, with absence, with a pause that stretches long enough for awareness to surface. And once you've felt that pause, truly felt it, the old rhythm never sounds the same again. Shame works because it does not need to shout. It does not threaten. It does not chase. It simply waits inside you, already installed, already fluent in your inner language. Once it is in place, no external control is required. You begin to anticipate judgment before it arrives. You correct yourself before anyone notices. You silence your own deviations before they form into words. The system does not need guards when you have become your own. This is why shame is favored by rigid structures, closed belief systems, and manipulative environments. It is efficient. It conserves energy. It transfers the labor of enforcement inward. Instead of resisting pressure, you absorb it. Instead of questioning authority, you internalize it. Surveillance becomes psychological, not physical. Permanent, not situational. What shame actually does is compress identity. It reduces the range of what you feel allowed to be. It narrows the corridor of acceptable thought until movement itself feels suspicious. You may still appear functional. You may even appear confident. But internally, options have been quietly removed, not forbidden outright, just made emotionally expensive. Every step outside the assigned role carries the threat of exposure, not to others, but to yourself. And that is the critical misunderstanding. Shame is often mistaken for a response to moral failure. It feels ethical. It presents itself as conscience. But if you examine it carefully, you notice something unsettling. The shame is not attached to harm caused. It is attached to deviation, to misalignment, to stepping outside a role that was defined long before you consented to it. You are not ashamed because something was wrong. You are ashamed because something no longer fits. Roles are powerful because they come with invisible contracts. They tell you who you are allowed to be, how far you are allowed to think, and what kind of questions signal danger. When you internalize a role deeply enough, the role becomes the reference point for self-evaluation. You no longer ask whether something is true, or humane, or coherent. You ask whether it aligns. And misalignment feels like personal failure, even when it is intellectual honesty. This is how shame maintains captivity. It convinces you that the discomfort you feel when questioning is evidence of your defect, rather than evidence of the system's fragility. It frames internal conflict as moral weakness instead of cognitive awakening. And because it feels intimate, because it feels like you, it is rarely questioned. What is often misunderstood is how shame dissolves. It is not confronted directly. It is not argued with. It is not healed through reassurance. Those approaches fail because they accept shame's premise, that it has authority, that it is responding to something real. Deprogramming does not attack shame. It removes the structure that gave shame meaning. When you begin to see that the standards judging you were never neutral, never universal, never inevitable, something subtle shifts. The role that once defined your worth starts to look contextual rather than absolute, historically contingent, socially engineered, psychologically convenient for someone other than you. And in that moment, shame loses its reference point, not dramatically, not with relief or release. There is no emotional explosion. Instead, something quieter happens. The shame still appears, but it no longer commands. It no longer explains reality. It becomes background noise. Deprogramming does not attack shame. It removes the structure that gave shame meaning. When you begin to see that the standards judging you were never neutral, never universal, never inevitable, something subtle shifts. The role that once defined your worth starts to look contextual rather than absolute, historically contingent, socially engineered, psychologically convenient for someone other than you. Without authority, like a rule from a game you are no longer playing. This is important, because relief still implies dependency. Relief suggests that shame mattered, and now it has been soothed. Irrelevance is different. Irrelevance means the emotion no longer organizes your decisions. It no longer frames your identity. It may still exist, but it cannot dictate direction. That is why systems fear irrelevance more than rebellion. Rebellion engages the structure. It pushes against it, keeping it central. Irrelevance dissolves it quietly. When the role dissolves, the shame attached to it has nowhere to land. You stop asking whether you are failing the standard and start noticing that the standard itself was designed to be unlivable. You see that your self-monitoring was never proof of virtue. It was proof of conditioning. And the moment that becomes clear, the internal guard has nothing left to protect. There is no triumph in this realization, no sense of victory, only a widening, a return of options, a quiet expansion of internal space where thought can move again without immediate penalty. You are not braver, you are not louder, you are simply no longer confined by an emotion that depended on a fiction to survive. And when shame becomes irrelevant, captivity does not need to be escaped. It simply collapses, because there is no one left inside to enforce it.